In this video, we are going to continue our discussion of market structures. Here we are going to look at supply, long-run equilibrium, and concentration measures. First, we need to look at supply functions for firms in the various market structures. Under perfect competition, the supply curve is simply the portion of the marginal cost curve which exists above the average variable cost curve. Only the part of our marginal cost curve which exists above the AVC curve is considered, because if we supply at any point below the AVC curve, our price will be below the average variable cost, so we will only be producing loss-making units and should shut the business down. The key takeaway from this is that the supply function in perfect competition is identifiable, but under any of the other three market structures, the supply function cannot be defined. Next, we need to look at the factors affecting long-run equilibrium. Firstly, let's look at perfect competition. In perfect competition, economic profits are possible in the short run if the price in the market is greater than our average total cost. Unfortunately, under the perfect competition structure, there are no barriers to entry, so new companies will enter the market to take advantage of any available profits, adding to the supply and dragging the market price down. This will continue to the point where price will equal the average total cost and no more extraordinary profits can be earned. Long-run sustainable economic profit is not possible in perfect competition. Now, as with perfect competition, in monopolistic competition, we still have the possibility of short-run economic profits if price is set above the average total cost. And we also have low barriers to entry, which allow new companies to come into the market when extraordinary profits are being earned. Although the barriers in this situation might not be as easy to overcome as with perfect competition, and consumers now have branding and marketing to hold their attention, economic profit will still theoretically be eroded to zero in the long run. The key difference between monopolistic and perfect competition is that in this market structure, the average total costs are not minimized in the long run. The equilibrium quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost does not occur at the minimum point on the average total cost curve. Now, what does that mean? It means that if we continue to expand production to the point where we are producing at our minimum average cost, we will actually not be achieving the maximum profit possible. Under a monopoly structure, barriers to entry are systematically very high. When you hear barriers to entry, we know right away that long-run economic profits are going to be sustainable. Firms who hold a monopoly over a product or service can effectively maintain their economic profits indefinitely if the barriers to entry remain too high for new entrant firms. Finally, we have the oligopoly structure. Under this structure, we can also have significant barriers to entry. Economic profits here are only sustainable if barriers to entry are high enough to prevent new entrants. The ability of a collusive group to maintain their power and interdependence will also be a driving factor of sustainable long-run economic profit. Now, the last thing we are going to cover in this section are the uses and limitations of concentration measures. Firstly, what do you think is the purpose of a concentration measure? The purpose of a concentration measure is to determine the level of competition in an industry. Ideally, we would like to look at the price elasticity of demand to discover the presence of a monopoly. Government and regulatory bodies could move in the case of a monopoly and ensure there is no detriment to the overall economy by allowing that monopoly to unfairly charge for their product or service. Unfortunately, we cannot accurately measure elasticity, so instead we use market share. Market share is simply calculated as the percentage of the total sales in the market which is earned by a particular firm. So if a particular industry has revenues of $100 billion per year and one company is looking at an annual turnover of $1 billion, then its market share is 1%. Concentration measures use the market share to determine if there is enough competition in the market. The four-firm concentration ratio simply adds up the four highest market shares to find out how much of the overall market is controlled by the four biggest companies. If this figure is too high, the regulators will step in. This is also a somewhat useful measure in determining whether or not a planned merger should be allowed to go through. By looking at the four-firm concentration ratio before the merger and comparing it to the potential concentration ratio if the merger was allowed to go through, we can see the impact to the overall level of competition and make a judgment. Now, there is a flaw in using the four-firm concentration ratio in that the drop in competition for mergers between very large companies is not highlighted effectively. Given a small change in the four-firm ratio, it might seem that competition still exists in the market even after a merger between two very significant players. This is where the HHI, the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, can be applied to give us a second opinion. The HHI is calculated by squaring each of the top four market shares. Even if the change in the four-firm ratio does not indicate a significant drop in competition, a significant change will occur in the HHI to prevent the regulator from underestimating the effect of a merger. Another major flaw in the use of concentration measures is the presence of barriers to entry. If barriers to entry are low, even if a particular firm has very significant market share, they may not have control over the price.